So I've been a middle school teacher for 19 years, a proud mother for 25, and for 20 years, I was married to the love of my life, my best friend, and my soulmate, Troy Schueller. On March 21st, 2018, Troy Schueller, former Coeurdalene High School principal, unexpectedly committed suicide. Today I'm here to share his story. I'm going to take you back to March 20th of 2018. Troy called me on his way home from school, just like he always did, and I remember saying, "Hey, you're calling me a little bit later than normal." He said, "Yeah, I had a meeting at the district office." And I said, "Did everything go okay?" And he said, "Yeah, it was fine." I said, "Are you sure?" You hesitated. And he said, "Yeah, it was okay." Being the wife of an administrator for several years, I had learned that there were days that Troy wanted to talk at length about what had happened at school, and there were days when he came home where he wanted to talk about anything but school. So at this point in time, I decided to let it go and wait and see what the mood was like once I got home that night. By the time I got there, he had cooked dinner, he'd opened a bottle of wine. It actually kind of felt like a celebration, and we were celebrating because in a couple of days, we would be on spring break, and we had a family trip planned to Hawaii. We went to bed, and I remember waking up at midnight that night to Troy coming into our room. And I remember saying, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Oh, I just can't sleep." Sleepless nights weren't uncommon for either one of us being in education for several years, so I didn't think too much of it. I decided to go sleep in the spare bedroom, though, because I didn't want to keep him up tossing and turning. When I came back in at 5 o'clock in the morning, Troy was wide awake watching TV. I now realize, looking back, he'd probably had been awake all night, planning his last day. We both went about our regular morning routine. On most days, Troy was in a big hurry to get out of the door. He was always the first one through the doors of the school, usually there by 5:30 in the morning, hoping to get in an hour of peace and quiet before the craziness of his day began. And so usually he was in a pretty big rush to get out of the door. But I remember this morning when he left, I remember when he hugged me, he held me tight. And I remember him pulling away after he kissed me, and he looked me right in the eyes and he said, "I love you." And I remember saying to him, "Wow, that was really nice." And now I realize that was his final goodbye, and that was the last time I saw him alive. On my way to school that morning, I drove by his school parking lot, and I noticed that his vehicle was missing. I called him and said, "Hey, where are you?" And he said, "Oh, I had a meeting at the district office." I remember cracking a joke about, "Oh, I know how much you love meetings." And I said, "Just hang in there, we only have one more day." And I told him I loved him, and that was the last time I heard his voice. Later on that afternoon, our school resource officer showed up in my classroom, and he told me that they had a welfare check for Troy at our house. And I remember going, "What?" At the time, I didn't even know what a welfare check was. He then said, "Is Troy depressed?" And I said, "What are you talking about? No, Troy isn't depressed." Shortly after, the school resource officer showed up from Coeurdalene High School with our son. He said that Troy had called him and asked him to bring our son to me, that he had been put on paid administrative leave at his meeting at the district office the night before, and that he was planning to take his own life. I got on my phone and tried to call him, and the phone went right to voicemail. I tried to text him, and instead of it turning blue like it always did, it turned green. Right then and there, I knew I had lost him forever. We were all in shock. None of us saw it coming. It didn't make any sense. Troy was educated and successful. As an administrator, he was known as being driven and hardworking, firm and fair, but he was also known as being kind and compassionate. People sought him out for advice all the time: students, teachers, parents, community members. I used to joke that he should have been a school counselor instead of a school administrator. And Troy was the type of person that would do anything for anybody. He wanted to win over the whole entire world. In addition to that, Troy had a strong support system. We had a loving and committed marriage. We didn't have any financial problems. Both of our children were doing very well, due in large part to the fact that Troy was a hands-on father. And he also had really fantastic friends. As a matter of fact, he talked to two of his best friends that morning, both of them also school administrators, who could have given him some pretty great advice on the situation he was facing. And Troy had resources. As a school administrator, he put people in connection with resources on a daily basis. I knew that somehow I was going to have to put the pieces of this puzzle together. I read after Troy died that actually only a small percentage of people who commit suicide actually leave a note. I knew that Troy wouldn't leave me without some sort of an explanation, so on the day he died, I chose to go home to find the note. When I got there, it wasn't there because the police had confiscated it, but when they brought it to me the next day, two lines really stood out to me. He said, "Ever since January of 2001, I haven't felt right. My body aches continuously, but my headache never goes away. That, along with this alleged complaint, leaves me only one way out." I knew exactly what January 2001 was all about. At the time, my husband had been a high school wrestling coach, and on his way to a high school wrestling tournament, the bus driver had suffered a massive heart attack and had died instantly at the wheel. My husband and another wrestler had ran to the front of the bus to try to keep it from crashing. When the bus crashed into a tree, he sprained his ankle, broke his knee, broke his jaw, and suffered major head trauma. It was so major, in fact, that he remembered the morning of the bus accident, but didn't remember anything again until 6 weeks later when he was at the state wrestling championship. 6 weeks of his memory was completely gone. When he talked about how his body ached continuously, in addition to the 2 surgeries he went through after the bus accident for his broken knee, when he was in high school, he had been in another major car accident, and at that time had also gone through a major back surgery. In his 20s, he started to experience some pretty severe back pain, so he went to visit a doctor. The doctor told him at that time his only option was to have metal rods put in his back, he would lose range of motion, and surely it would lead to other surgeries. His suggestion, tough it out for as long as you can. So at that point in time, that's when my husband started to live with chronic pain on a daily basis. In the next part of the letter, when he talked about how he had a headache that never went away, in the 1.5 years before my husband died, he experienced 2 more major concussions. The first one was on a day much like today. He went over to plow my sister's driveway out, and he slipped on the ice and smashed his head into the concrete driveway. That following summer, when we were out boating, we had stopped, and he was swinging on a rope swing on a bridge, and when he swung across the lake and flipped into the water, he hit his head at a weird angle. When he talked about how he hadn't felt right, that took a little bit more investigation. My father-in-law actually visited a doctor not long after, and the doctor mentioned something about CTE. And at the time, it really took me back. When I thought of CTE, I thought about the movie Concussion, and I thought about NFL football players. So after doing a little bit of research, I learned that CTE is a degenerative brain disease that slowly attacks the brain cells over time. Symptoms do not generally appear until years later after the initial brain trauma. In people's 20s and 30s, they'll experience control problems, aggression, depression, and paranoia. In their 40s and 50s, cognitive symptoms generally appear. When Troy had said, along with these alleged complaints, I learned after he had died at that meeting at the district office, he had been accused of breaking the school district's drug policy by taking opioids. And slowly but surely after he died, people one by one started coming to me with their stories. One of his best friends who told me that he'd been visiting his grandmother, who had caught him taking prescription medication from her bathroom. He had also been visiting an uncle more frequently who also had prescription medication in his home. There were stories from students and staff members who Troy had visited after they had had surgeries, who also said that prescription medication had disappeared after he had been there. Even our own son and daughter came to me with stories about Dad taking prescription medication, and he had said, "Hey, don't tell Mom." I quickly realized that Troy had turned to opioids as a way to try to deal with his chronic pain and his headaches so he could continue to do his job as the principal and so he could continue to take care of his family. In another part of his final letter, Troy had said, "I never wanted to let you down." I realized that the last thing that had killed him was his own pride. See, we had grown up in a small town where our heroes were loggers and mill workers and truck drivers. These were men with a tremendous work ethic, tough men who toughed it out no matter what, and you never complained. I also knew that Troy's good name meant the world to him. I quickly realized that it literally killed Troy to think about asking for help. So at this point in time, I knew how and why he had died, but I didn't know how I was going to go on without him. The best word I can use to describe what I went through is devastation. And for a year and a half, I didn't live, I survived. The only thing that forced me to get out of bed every morning was knowing that if I didn't get up and try to at least pretend like I was okay, was that my own 2 children wouldn't have been able to go on. The worst part is living with the guilt. I couldn't figure out how I didn't know what was happening. I was supposed to be Troy's person. Why hadn't he come to me for help? So, after a year and a half of living this way, the only way I could get through was to build up a wall around myself to try to protect myself. I could talk about Troy and tell stories about him all day and talk about the type of person he was, but to try to talk about what had happened forced me to break down every time. I realized I couldn't go on like this anymore. My counselor had said, "Well, maybe since you can't talk about it, maybe you should write about it." So one day, out of desperation, I sat down and I wrote. And at the end of 6.5 hours, I had a pretty powerful story that I thought maybe could help others. But what I really realized is there are 4 things in our society that have to change. Number 1, we have to continue research on concussions and CTE. There's no way for me to know for sure that Troy had CTE. By the time I suspected it, it was too late. Troy had requested to be cremated. But I really believe in my heart that that's why Troy hadn't felt right for so many years. The second thing we have to do is we need to begin research to find new ways to help people that are dealing with chronic pain. I believe that opioids serve a purpose in the short term, somebody who's undergone surgery that's going to be better in a couple of weeks. But for somebody like my husband who was dealing with chronic pain for several years, opioid use leads to addiction because after time, the pain-relieving effects lessen and the pain actually increases. Dependence leads to painful withdrawal symptoms, making it very difficult to stop. We have to give our doctors other options to help patients that are dealing with pain on a day-to-day basis, year after year after year. The next thing I would like to see changed are our privacy laws. I went to see the school administrator who had put Trey on administrative leave to find out about that final meeting. And I remember on my way out of the door, her saying to me, "I wish I could have called you, but because of privacy laws, I couldn't." I understand the need for privacy laws. I wouldn't want my employer to be able to share my personal information with the public, but I would like to change them so that people can volunteer to appoint somebody on their behalf. somebody that could be contacted if their employer has any concerns about them for any reason. I know that if Troy and I would have had this option, we would have appointed each other, and I honestly believe if I would have gotten a phone call that night, he would still be with me today. The fourth thing that we've got to change in our society is we need to spend more money on mental health. People cannot be kept from the counseling that they need because of lack of money or because of lack of insurance. And we have got to open up more mental health facilities for people in our cities and towns. So I decided to share my story with my own 2 children and a close group of friends. And they all felt like the story was very powerful and that it could help other people dealing with the same issues. And they also thought that hopefully by sharing this story, that these 4 issues could be addressed in our society. So we created a webpage called TroyStory.com, and we shared it through a social media campaign, kind of a pay-it-forward challenge. We asked people that once they read the story to please share it with 5 more people. People described Troy's story as being raw and brutally honest. And I quickly realized that that must be what we need, because within 48 hours, 85,000 people in over 50 states had visited the site. Troy's story suddenly had a new purpose. I realized that by sharing Troy's story, it was breaking the silence and removing the stigma around concussions, CTE, opioid addiction, mental health, and suicide. It was opening up the door to important conversations. People were talking about Troy's story in their church groups. Teachers were talking about it in their classrooms with their students. College professors added it to their curriculum. People started sharing their own stories on social media. And my favorite stories were tough, well-respected men who came to me and said, "I've never talked about these issues until I read Troy's story." And one good friend came to me and told a story of how by sharing Troy's story, we had actually saved somebody else's life. What I learned after a year and a half about not being able to talk about this is that you have to be strong to ask for help. Troy didn't ask for help because he didn't want people to know that he was weak. So I'm hoping that if we really, truly, openly, and honestly start talking about these issues, that our culture will change so that when people are weak, they won't be afraid to ask for help. So in conclusion, yes, my husband died by suicide, but I also believe he slowly died over the years by the events that unraveled from a bus accident in January of 2001. And when I look back, I try to be grateful. I'm grateful because if he would have died that day, our son, who I was pregnant with at the time, would have never known his dad. He would have never given our daughter away at her wedding or given her her high school diploma. He would have never held our 2 grandchildren, and I would have never experienced the wonderful, loving marriage that I did, that some people live their whole lives and never experience. Would I do it all again, knowing how it ends? The answer is yes. But I don't want anybody else's story to end the way that ours did, and I don't want any other family to endure what our family has. So I'm asking you to please talk about this openly and honestly. I understand that it's uncomfortable at first, but I have learned that people have to be uncomfortable for change to occur. And these issues have to change. I know from firsthand experience that lives are depending on it. Thank you.